Francesca Gasparis is from the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. She joins us now. Francesca, good afternoon to you. So we've got all of these conversations going on. In a way, it's the usual thing, politicians arguing about money. What kind of approach do you believe delegates at COP28 should adopt?
Well, that's a great question, Stephen, and good afternoon to you all as well. I mean, it's a painstaking process, this negotiation process, and I'd say Dubai is characterized by this big expo site with hundreds upon thousands of more people than we've seen before. And so, usually NGOs and civil society have got their badges that were allowed into the room. And what we're seeing is that oftentimes we haven't been let in. There hasn't been enough space despite this grand expo site. And I think that so far I can say that South Africa and the bloc that it negotiates with is trying very hard to see the issues that we find most critical for Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa, for Southern Africa, and for South Africa. Things like the adaptation fund that really needs to have money going towards it. These things have been on the table since Paris, the Paris Agreement, as many people have heard, and we're just not seeing a commitment or political will coming from those who are historically responsible for climate change. And that's mostly the developed nations who developed using carbon. So what's happened now is that we've got none left, and we need to, especially the global north, needs to reduce its carbon footprint, and they need to allow space for the south to develop in ways that actually is not going to create more negative impacts of climate change. So the negotiators have got a very tough job. They've just finished the global stocktake. That took days just to read through it. And now they're starting to get more into the substance. I mean, these are highly technical issues, and there's some very skilled people from South Africa here at COP doing important work.
There's a lot going on in here, because part of it is essentially the richer world being asked and being told you have a responsibility to help the rest of the world, or the global south, to actually get through all of this. I don't know if the rich world see it in that way, and is that going to be part of the problem? They're going to need quite a lot of convincing, even though they're the ones who are responsible for this.
It is part of the problem. You know, whenever you say to someone, you need to stump up some cash to pay for what you've done, they will try and get out of that, especially if it's a lot of cash. And in this instance, we're talking about billions upon trillions of US dollars needed to address climate change effectively. So not only do they need to completely change how their economies are being run, and we know it's the top 100 emitters in the world who are really most responsible and need to make the most changes, but also they need to pay retributions to the countries who are already suffering. We know South Africa has already been hit by climate change. Those terrible floods in KwaZulu-Natal, the floods in Zimbabwe with Hurricane Idai. I mean, that was devastating and over 4 years ago, and we're still not seeing people actually getting the kind of support, the vulnerable communities getting the kind of support that actually they are owed. So, if you break something of someone else's, you are then responsible for it, and it's that simple. We know from the science, no one's disputing the science, the North and heavy emitters are responsible for what's happening in the South and globally, and they need to make payments. They need to find new and additional funding, and there's a lot of reluctance to do so. And unfortunately, it's against the backdrop of these global wars that we're seeing, which are costing billions upon trillions, and the money always seems to come for that, but not for climate change. And, it's watching a train wreck happening, and it's really quite disturbing.
So, Francesca, as South Africans, we see ourselves as part of the global south, I think correctly. Technically, by some other definitions, we're described as an upper middle income country. I realize that that's very contentious. So if I were the global north and I wanted to be difficult, I would say, well, South Africa, you actually should help countries that are poorer than you, also because you're quite a big emitter, thanks Eskom. Could that be a little difficult for us?
Look, it's one of the reasons why we were one of the first countries to get the just energy transition, recognizing that South Africa is one of the top emitters. It's 13th in the world, but comparatively, it's tiny compared to the others. So, I mean, if you really look at the maths, we're not actually that terrible, but indeed we do need to change where we're getting our energy from. We need to move away from fossil fuels, and that's the bottom line. It's not phase down, it's phase out. That's what we need to see, a stopping and a commitment to no longer using fossil fuels. And that's terribly difficult globally. So it's a big challenge that we have. I think South Africa does need help. We're not a huge emitter compared to others. And I think we have an opportunity to be real leaders on the continent in terms of how we move away from fossil fuels. And I think there's a real commitment to do so. Even though our energy policies are very contested, you know that SAFC and others are right up there, going to court against the government if we have to. But really, I do think that we need to get aligned and we need to get this clear within our policies. That hasn't happened yet. But I think that there's a real potential for South Africa, if we get it right, to be a world leader in terms of the just energy transition. I'm very critical of it as well. So,
sure.
I want to say that there's a real opportunity for us in this crisis, and we should look to the opportunity. We often hear a lot of the negatives about job losses and so on. What about job creation? What about the opportunities?
And Francesca, in the middle of all of this, so for example, there's a big argument around the use of gas. The argument for gas is that, yes, it's a fossil fuel, it pollutes far less than coal and others, and therefore, it can always be on. And this is the argument sort of for car power ships. The argument against it is that it's still a fossil fuel. We at the moment, our government has said they want car power ships. We're still awaiting the environmental processes on some of those. I think 2 of the licenses have been granted. At least one of those is being appealed. I'm sure the other will be too. Do we need gas?
Well, I would say that this is one of the most critical things for us to look at. We can't keep emitting and increasing our emissions. We've made national commitments. If we start moving on to gas and car power ships, I think that's the biggest threat to other fossil fuel jobs. Because ultimately, there's a top that we can exploit. These are all finite resources. And they're tough decisions. Yes, they may be finding gas off the coast of South Africa. As an environmentalist, I, of course, am very anti that, and I don't believe we need gas in the just energy transition. And all the modeling is supporting that. We don't need to invest in another expensive form of fossil fuel. What we need to do now is get our house in order, start to phase out coal, recognizing it's a finite solution. How much can we keep going in terms of jobs? How much do we need to move towards renewables? All of this needs to be very carefully worked out so that we actually put people who are most vulnerable in South Africa front and center, and so that South Africa remains competitive on the global world stage. One of our big challenges is that, of course, we see the North moving in certain ways which kind of starts to exclude South Africa from the global markets. We don't want to see that. So we really do want to see fair and equitable decision-making at COP, and we really want South Africa to get a chance to do a just energy transition. For us, neither gas nor nuclear should be part of that. That's what the independent energy modelers are saying. So I think it's absolutely clear, and that's where, of course, we do tend to clash with some members of our government who say they'd still want to go down those energy roads. They're not necessary, and we can see that. That's not something that we're saying as civil society, although we do say it, it's coming from research and independent science.
I'm sure you'll get a phone call from the Minister of Energy, Francesca. Thank you. Francesca Gasparis is from the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. More news in a moment.